Wow, praise the Lord. I'm so glad to see so many faces here today. I'm so glad that so many of you were able to make time out of your busy weeks to be able to join us here. And yes, so for some of you, it might be your first time here. And so I'll just say a quick word of introduction about myself. My name's Stephen. I graduated from the University of Chicago in 2018. So shout out to all the U Chicago students who are here. But I'm serving on staff with Christians on campus, mainly at Northwestern University and a little bit at U Chicago as well. And I'm so happy to be able to be here with all of you today. And so today we'll be getting into the story of Noah. And so I'll pull up my slides real quickly so that you can follow along with me. Yeah. And here we go. Cool. So our topic this week, this is actually going to be the first of a two-part message covering the story of Noah. So this is the first part. And so I prepared a little thing just to kind of nicely summarize what we're going to go over today. And so maybe you can just read it together with me. It says, Noah was dependent on God, received grace and faith from God, and wasted himself on God. Wow. Now I know what you might be thinking, that last phrase especially, this word, that Noah wasted himself upon God. That sounds a little bit strong, right? Now what I mean by this, I don't mean that, oh, we should all be like Noah and we should all drop out of university and go become monks or priests or something. Although if you feel that's your calling, I won't stop you. But what I'm saying though is that what this means though is that as we're pursuing our education, as we're pursuing our livelihood, like Noah was, Noah had the realization that he wasn't living for these things, that they were not the meaning of his life, but instead the meaning of his life is God and God's purpose. And so we'll develop this idea more as we go throughout today's message. And we'll unpack a little more what it means to be dependent on God, what it means to receive grace and faith from God, and how we can do that. And unpack even more what it means to be someone who, you could say, wastes themselves on God. But firstly, in order to fully understand the story of Noah, in some way continuation of the story of Cain and Abel. Now, what I mean by that, well, let's cover a little bit of ground that we covered last quarter regarding Cain and Abel. So coming to Genesis 3:21, it says, and Jehovah God made coats of skin for Adam and for his wife and clothed them. And so this verse here comes right after when God had found out that Adam and Eve had eaten of the tree of knowledge, which they weren't supposed to eat of. And this is basically how God responded to the fall of man. He responded by taking the skins of an animal and clothing Adam and Eve's unrighteousness. And in order to obtain the skins of those animals, an animal had to be killed. And this was probably done in front of Adam and Eve. And this is actually one of the earliest pictures of Jesus, actually. Because John 1:29 tells us that Jesus is the true Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. He's the fulfillment, you could say, of the lamb that was killed for Adam and Eve in Genesis 3:21. Now, what does this have to do with Cain and Abel, though? Well, it's very, Cain and Abel must have definitely heard about this from their parents, Adam and Eve. So when Abel both came to offer something to God, we see that Abel, he brought an offering according to what Adam and Eve had saw. He brought the firstlings of his flock. He brought probably a lamb. And so that is why Jehovah had regard for Abel and for his offering, as we see here in verse 4. But Jehovah had no regard for Cain and for his offering. And last quarter, a question we asked was, why was this the case? And we see that it's because Cain offered something not according to what God had shown Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Instead, he offered something according to his own invention, something that he thought was good in his own sight. And so this illustrates for us two important principles. First is the principle of Cain, which simply put is independence from God. This is the principle of Cain. Whereas the principle of Abel is salvation through dependence on God's grace. Wow. And so Abel, when he saw this matter from his parents concerning God's coming salvation, as illustrated by the lamb that was slain, this led him to give his entire profession to this matter. This led him to, you could say, well, actually, Abel chose to become a shepherd at a time when sheep were not even good for food to eat. Actually, at this point in Genesis 4, God had only given to man plants to eat of. It's not until Genesis 9 that God gives man to eat of animals as well. And so Abel enters a profession that in the eyes of man has no use. It seems impractical. But he gave his whole life and his whole daily living to producing what would be pleasing in the eyes of God. And so this is another illustration to us, another instance of a dear believer who sees how great the desire of God's heart is, and who, you could even say, wastes himself upon the Lord in such a way. But of course, we know how this story ends, though. We know that Cain ends up killing his brother Abel out of jealousy over this matter. And so then there's a number of chapters that link the end of Cain and Abel's story, when Cain kills Abel, to the time of Noah. And so those passages are quite long, and we will ambitiously try to cover them in this chart right here. And so we see up here, we see Adam and Eve, and we see that they had Cain, right? And then they also had Abel, whom Cain killed. And Cain, we know, illustrates independence from God. Whereas Abel, we see he lived in a manner that was dependent on God. But thankfully, though, after Cain killed Abel, God gave them another child. God gave them Seth, in whom the principle of dependence on God would be allowed to continue. And we see, in fact, that's the way that Seth and his descendants took. But before we cover that, let's just, we'll pretty much be spending the rest of this time going through this chart step by step. So don't be intimidated if it seems a little bit messy, or if it seems like a lot. We'll cover each one of these items. And so continuing on from after Cain killed Abel, we see that his independence from God is clearly illustrated by this verse, Genesis 4:16 over here. And yeah, this is my laser pointer, by the way, in case anyone's wondering. And so Genesis 4:16 shows us that Cain, after he killed his brother Abel, it says he went forth from the presence of Jehovah. So Cain, he departed from the presence of God, showing his determination to live a life independently from God, to take care of his own needs, to care for his own survival. And so continuing down, if you read about Cain's descendants in the second half of chapter 4, we see that one of Cain's descendants is Lamech. And what happened with Lamech is that Lamech multiplied Cain's violence. he said, if God will avenge Cain sevenfold, then Lamech will be avenged 77-fold. Wow. And he said that after he had killed a young man for wounding him. And so we see that Lamech was one who was arrogant, he was violent, and he multiplied Cain's violence because he continued to live in independence from God. And then Lamech had further descendants as well. Oh, sorry about that. We see he had a descendant named Jabal, who invented tents. And then another one named Jubal, who invented musical instruments. And then another descendant named Tubal-Cain, who invented tools and weapons. Now, what do all of these mean? Well, all three of these basically illustrate to us man's efforts to create a living independently from God, right? So the tents that Jabal invented, they're the earliest forms of housing, right? We all need housing, we all need shelter, right? And then Jubal came up with musical instruments, right? And this represents entertainment. That could correspond with all kinds of things today, Netflix, Spotify, you name it, right? And Tubal-Cain came up with tools and weapons representing man's needs for survival. And so we see that when man lives independently from God, he begins to become usurped by these things. These things and these concerns begin to take over their life. You know, for thousands of years, right? Humanity has been concerned with this matter of survival. But maybe more applicable to us today is the tents and the musical instruments, right? You know, we all have maybe that friend or that uncle whose dream is to own a mansion or something like that, right? Many people today, they have a sort of unhealthy obsession with wanting to secure a great big tent for themselves, right? And also, wow, musical instruments. I don't know about you guys, but for me, this might be the biggest sort of usurping factor in my life, distracting me from God. I know when I was in college, I might have had days or even weeks where I spent more time watching Netflix than I did studying. And if that's not an unhealthy occupation with these things, then I don't know what is, right? And so we see that man's independence from God causes violence to multiply, and it causes them to become occupied by these things, by dwellings, by entertainment, by survival. These things become man's occupation rather than what is on God's heart. And all of this kind of produces the circumstances we see in the story of Noah, the circumstance that led God to wipe away the world with a flood. Genesis 6:5 and 11 tells us, every imagination of man's heart was only evil continually. Wow. And that the earth was filled with violence. And so this is the product, the ultimate result when man chooses to live in independence from God. But thankfully, though, that's not the end of the story. We come to Genesis 6:8. Genesis 6:8 says, but Noah. Wow, wonderful, that phrase. In the midst of all of this evil, in the midst of all of this violence that was flooding the earth, there is this phrase, but Noah found favor in the sight of Jehovah. Wow, how precious. None of us would be here today if Noah didn't find such favor. But we see, though, that the favor that Noah found, and also the faith that enabled Noah to ultimately build the ark, it didn't just come up out of nowhere, you know. Actually, the record in concerning Noah, concerning his lineage, all of the things that we see in Genesis, these aren't just historical accounts, but these are also even pictures, records of the development of our faith and our walk with God. And so starting with Abel and then Seth, we see dependence on God. And this is illustrated in Enosh, one of Seth's descendants. Genesis 4:6 says, "At that time, men began to call on the name of Jehovah. This was the time when Enosh was born." This is how Enosh's birth was described. When Enosh was born, men began to call on the name of Jehovah. Enosh began this practice of calling on the Lord's name among men. How wonderful is that? And then one of Enosh's descendants, not to be confused, very similar name, Enoch. Genesis 5:4, what it says about Enoch is that Enoch walked with God. Enoch was one who walked with God, meaning that he let God into all the things of his daily living, all the things related to his profession, his family, all of these things, Enoch walked with God in them. And it is all of these, it's because Noah inherited all of these holy ways from his ancestors that he was able, in Genesis 6:8, at the crucial moment, to find favor in the sight of Jehovah. So what does this mean for us? Well, what this means for us is, maybe there will be a time when, there will be a critical moment in your life when God could use you to carry out a special move, to carry out a particular move for his purpose, just like Noah did. But the question is, though, do we have the faith to accomplish that move? Do we have the favor from Jehovah to accomplish that move? And that doesn't just come out of nowhere. That doesn't just spring up in us miraculously at the time when we need it. But instead, it is rooted in a daily living based on these things, based on calling on the name of the Lord, based on walking together with God in our daily life. It's how we live in our daily life. It's turning to the Lord in our daily life that will equip us with the faith necessary to be useful to God in an extraordinary circumstance. So I hope that we can all see that and really give ourselves to the Lord in this way. Just to conclude our time today with a little bit of a practical fellowship, next week we'll see just how great Noah's faith was, that he was able to overcome so much opposition to build the ark, to build this crazy football field sized boat, to carry out God's purpose, right? And to preserve mankind for God's purpose. But this wasn't just done at no expense to Noah. Noah paid dearly in two ways. He paid with his time, and he paid also with his resources, or his money, you could say. And just the practical points to leave you guys with today is that, how we spend our time and how we spend our money says a lot about our walk with the Lord and what place the Lord has in our heart as well. And so I know for me, time-wise, I know that I should make time to call on the Lord's name. I know that I should make time to pray. I know that I should make time to walk with God and get into his word. But my heart for it is quite small. And so, whereas my heart for Netflix is quite big, and so I have no problem spending hours upon hours, watching my favorite whatever. But I always make so little time to get into God's word, though. But thankfully, though, we can look away to God to infuse us with faith, to infuse us with believing power. We can pray a simple prayer like, Lord, day by day, even just a little, change my heart more to have a heart for these things, to have a heart for your purpose and for your word. And so to conclude our time, I just want to revisit our focus statement one more time. And I'll just read it for you again. Noah was dependent on God, received grace and faith from God, and wasted himself on God. So may we be before the Lord concerning our daily walk with him as well, so that we can be dependent on him, receive grace and faith from him, and even spend our time, spend our money on him. Spend money not just to feed ourselves, but maybe even you could spend money on a nice meal for some of your friends to make them happy, to warm their hearts, even for the sake of the gospel, so that you can speak something of the Lord to them. These are all little ways in which we can give ourselves to be today's Noahs.